So welcome back, everyone. So today we're going to start, as I said earlier, a series on the Five Skandhas and be exploring the first one. Skandha literally translates as heap or aggregate. So you can think of, say, if you're having a patio done, before the landscaper turns up, you'll probably end up with a pile of hardcore for your sub base, some sharp sand, a pile of cement, a pile of bricks or patio slabs, and maybe some kiln dried sand go in between the gaps. And before anyone does anything, it's just 5 heaps in your garden. At some point, someone comes along and puts them down in a particular order, in a particular way. And those 5 heaps, though they haven't changed their nature particularly, we can then call a patio. At some point in the future, maybe you've moved on and someone else is in the house and they want something else in the garden. So it's broken up, your nice patio, and it becomes heaps again. So this is the way we want to think of skandhas, as 5 heaps. Some of you may have come across the 5 skandhas before. If you've done a 7-fold puja, you'd have come across the Heart Sutra. And at the start of that, it starts with the words, the Bodhisattva of Compassion, when he meditated deeply, saw the emptiness of all 5 skandhas and sundered the bonds that caused him suffering. So this suggests if we understand the 5 skandhas, meditate deeply on them, and understand their true nature, then we can put an end to suffering. So by understanding the skandhas, we can free ourselves, we can become awakened. So what are these 5 skandhas? So hopefully a slide will come up in a moment. So we have Rupa, which is form. We have Vijnana, which is consciousness. We have Samnya, which is perception. Vedana, which is feeling tone. And Samskara, or volition. Sometimes in, say, in the Heart Sutra, they're given a slightly different order and translated slightly differently. In the Heart Sutra, it's form, feeling, thought, and choice, and consciousness. So I've put this in a particular order to help us understand the nature of the 5 skandhas individually, though they are still 5 heaps. So in the same way, if you're having a patio laid, if your layer put your patio slabs down first and then the hardcore and sand on top, it wouldn't be that helpful. So in the same way, I've changed the order a little bit, so we can understand maybe the process of what goes on within the skandhas, to help us understand each one, even though they are by nature each a heap. So Sangharakshita says something about the skandhas, which will come up now. So Bhante sees them as representing the whole of conditioned mundane existence, or in more traditional terms, the whole of samsara. Okay. So they represent the whole of conditioned existence. They represent samsara. We need to be a little bit careful at this point, particularly with our Western conditioning and Christian conditioning, or Judeo-Christian conditioning. Sometimes we think then if we have samsara here and we're in samsara, then nirvana is up there somewhere. Going back to the idea of God sitting on a cloud, that we want to be in this cloud somewhere free of suffering. So it's quite easy to get the wrong end of the stick. I would say Bhante hasn't said enough about the skandhas. I would say they encompass the whole of existence, both samsara and nirvana. So to illustrate a point, I remember many years ago I did a solitary retreat. This was before I was ordained, and I was reading the middle-length discourses of the Pali Canon, and throughout that there's these little stock phrases, and the Buddha says there is no self to be found in the five skandhas. There's no self to be found in form, feeling, thought, choice, consciousness. And I kept reading this and I kept contemplating this. And the idea occurred to me, it's like, wow, that means the self is outside of the five skandhas. How does that work? And after being really excited by this for quite a while, I then read another bit and it said something similar. And then I went, no, I've totally misunderstood. The Buddha was just saying there is no self. And as the five skandhas are all encompassing, there's no self to be found. So it's worth bearing that in mind. So with the Bodhisattva of Compassion, he saw the emptiness of the five skandhas. And that's what allowed him, seeing the emptiness or the conditioned nature of the five skandhas, allows us to be free from suffering. And it's that mental view, that awakening to how things really are, that we're actually trying to do. It's not that the world suddenly changes or we live in a different world. So the Buddha still had, as far as I could understand, the five skandhas. His understanding of them was different to ours. So yeah, we need to understand the nature of the five skandhas. Some of you be familiar with the story of Shariputra and Moggalyana. These were two of the Buddha's leading disciples. They were friends, and similar to the Buddha, they went out on a quest to search for truth, search for freedom. And they'd go around lots of teachers and they weren't getting anywhere. So they made a pact that they'd go off individually, and if either of them would find the truth, then they'd come back and tell the other one. So one day, Shariputra was wandering around northern India, and he came across another wanderer called Asaji, or in Sanskrit, Ashvajit. So he was quite taken by Asaji, and he started to ask him about who his teacher was and what his teacher taught. And Asaji said the following, which again will come up on our screens. Regarding dharmas in this case means things rather than the teaching. So regarding things that arise from a cause, the Tathagata or Buddha taught their cause and also their cessation. These were the words of the great mendicant. So regarding, if you like, the skandhas arise from a cause, the Tathagata taught their cause and also their cessation. So Shariputra immediately recognized these words as truth and became a Buddhist, as did Moggalyana. One thing I like about this story, got nothing to do with the skandhas whatsoever, but the two leading disciples of the Buddha, or two of the leading disciples of the Buddha, received their initial teachings from someone other than the Buddha. So Asaji was one of the Buddha's first 5 disciples that he found after his awakening. There used to be disciples before him, with him before his awakening, and left him, and then he came and taught them. And Asaji was one of the first 5 that awakened to the Buddha's teaching. So all things arise in dependence upon a cause and upon the ceasing of which they cease. So we need to explore this with the skandhas. So if we understand the conditioned nature of the skandhas, we by necessity understand that the skandhas are empty of a self. So they are anatman or anatta. So this is what Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of Compassion, is recounting in the Heart Sutra, that he saw the emptiness of the five skandhas and freed himself from suffering. And by seeing the conditioned nature of something, we realize it's empty of any fixed, permanent, unchanging self or attributes. So that's what, or this is what we're going to be exploring over the next 5 sessions. So today, we're particularly going to look at Rupa, which is form. So we'll have a look now at the qualities of Rupa, or the attributes. Depending on the list, the main qualities or attributes are the 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air. Rupa also includes the sense organs, so the eyes, ears, nose, and so on, and their objects, so sight objects, sound objects, touch objects. And depending on the list, Rupa can also have 13 to 15 secondary characteristics, which is a little bit of a random list, which includes things like masculinity and femininity, whether something's flexible, whether it has the quality of pliability, and so on. So the ones that we're really interested today are the 4 elements. And by nature, these do include the sense organs and their objects. So, good. So when we think about the 4 elements or come across the 4 elements, they sometimes seem a bit archaic in our modern tech world. It's something that our primitive ancestors would have been interested in, splitting up the world around us into things that are solid, things that are liquid, things that are kind of energetic and fiery, and air. But actually they're quite a comprehensive list, and they're quite useful. Some of you may have been here a few months ago on a Thursday night when Siddhartha did the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And the first of the foundations of mindfulness is kaya, or body. So it's contemplating our physical body, both internally, and contemplating the body externally. And that first foundation of mindfulness that the Buddha taught is very much about Rupa, it's about form. So some of you may be familiar with some of this. So at this point, if you need to, you can just close the eyes. I'm just going to describe some of the qualities or some reflections on the 4 elements, and maybe take it a little bit further than that. So these are things for us to contemplate, things to think about. So our bodies are constantly changing. It's said somewhere that every 7 years our body is different. It totally regenerates and refreshes itself. And we do that by the exchange of the 4 elements. So we eat, it nourishes the body, and then we excrete what we've eaten. So there's a constant interplay of conditionality with the earth element. We drink. Again, we process that, we urinate, we sweat, and so on. So we take in the earth element, and the earth element flows out of us. We have the fire element, which can be heat. So So we go down to a cellular level of the body. The center of each cell, they're smaller than that really, you have mitochondria, and that's the powerhouse of the cells of each cell of the body, and that burns energy and releases heat. So we take on fuel in the form of food and drink, and we burn that to keep alive. So if we have too much heat, we feel hot, and if we don't have enough heat, we feel cold. So it's the earth element is going on, the fire element goes on within us all the time. And of course we have the air element, breathing. If you're not breathing, or certainly for more than a few minutes, then you're not alive. So it's really what keeps us going. It's the quality of life. It's the breath. So we breathe in and we breathe out. And there's an exchange of gases, of oxygen for carbon dioxide. So these four great elements are going on all the time. Our body is in a constant state of flux. So it's worth just contemplating that. Interestingly, the four elements are sometimes in Buddhism called the four Mahabhutas, which means the great ghosts. So sometimes it's quite hard to pin down quite what they are. It's somehow like you can't quite get to their essence, because in a way, they don't have an essence. So we're made up of these four elements, of these four ghosts. And somehow we think maybe that's ourselves. But it's constantly changing. And the Buddha said, if things arise independent upon conditions, they cease. So there cannot be any self within form, within Rupa. So we may be able to see this internally and externally. I think sometimes we think of the body as quite static. But really, there's an awful lot going on that we're just not aware of. Modern science, particularly biology, helps us with this. The body is an incredibly complicated chemistry set. So all the time that we're just sitting here, there's chemical reactions going on in our body. It can be in the mitochondria. Any movement we do with muscles, some of you I can see moving at this point. There's a whole complex interplay of chemical reactions to allow any muscle movement. Even just blinking involves complicated chemistry. So the body is constantly changing. Everything about it is constantly in flux. But we don't really think about that. You could go smaller than that, and on a microscopic or a quantum level, everything's in flux. Everything that we see as solid is in a state of change. So all of form is, all of Rupa is constantly arising and passing away. Sometimes we can see this in nature. At this point, it's September. Technically, from a meteorological point of view, I think that means it's autumn. Soon, the weather's going to change, the leaves are going to change colour, the leaves will fall off and take us into winter, take us into spring. So we can see the change in Rupa, in form, in our environment. We can see it in the change of the weather. So everything is constantly changing, internally and externally. And between internal and external, there's a constant interplay, an exchange of the elements. So I wonder where self fits into that. Can we really find a self if there's this constant process of change? maybe that's some homework for you. But in a way, we can go a bit more cosmic than that. So the world around us, the life around us, is carbon-based. We kind of know this, but we may not have really thought, why is life on planet Earth carbon-based? Silicon has very similar properties to carbon. So why aren't we silicon-based? Why aren't we all silicon chips in our brains? Well, some people may think that happens, but that's a totally different talk. So why are we carbon-based? Why is life on this planet carbon-based? I suppose the obvious answer is there's plenty of carbon, there's plenty of oxygen as well. So why is there plenty of carbon and oxygen? You know, they're lighter elements. So some of you may remember your periodic table from chemistry at school. So most of life is based around the lighter elements. And the lighter elements are more abundant. And there's a reason for this, that in the early moments, days, weeks of the universe after the Big Bang, there were hydrogen and some helium atoms. And at times there was a kind of a collection of them, and under gravity they kind of coalesced. And they coalesced into what we call stars. And some of you may know the process of stars, where the process of the sun that gives us the energy, gives us the life in a way, the fire element for the world, is nuclear fusion. So under the intense heat and pressure in the sun, the elements fuse together. So you get heavier elements, and you get hydrogen turns into helium. And then as the hydrogen burns, the helium fuses and so on, and you start to get heavier and heavier elements, including things like carbon and oxygen. At some point, if that particular star was heavier enough, if there was enough volume of hydrogen, it collapses, and under that weight of gravity, it then explodes into a supernova, a bright explosion into the sky. And what the star is doing is almost vomiting those heavier elements. It's vomiting out into the universe carbon, oxygen, and so on. So all the heavy elements that make up our body was formed in stars, literally fused together in that solar kind of process. And then somehow, under gravity, again, they kind of coalesced, and for us, they came together in what we now call Earth, the planet that we live on. So we have this, you know, we kind of think, oh, I've got a self, this is me, this is my body. But, you know, we just started off as a load of neutrons and protons, which turned into hydrogen, which turned into the heavier elements. And somehow upon that, we think there's a self. How does that work? Maybe it doesn't actually work. So there's some things to think about. So Rupa, form is conditioned. It rises on a cosmic scale, it rises on a quantum scale, and it's in a constant state of flux. And if it's in a constant state of flux, there cannot be a fixed, permanent, changing entity there. So it's conditioned. It's empty of an unchanging nature. So that's something for us to think about. So next week, we're going to look at consciousness. So if there's no fixed, permanent self within form, maybe we'll have better luck in vijnana, in consciousness. So I will leave you with that thought.